Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, I'll be talking about two severe weather events that'll be occurring across the United States over the next few days, bringing the risk for significant damaging winds, large to very large hail, and tornadoes. I'll also be breaking down a huge heat wave that is going to impact even more states over the next few days. I'll give you the latest breakdown on everything that you need to know in this forecast, but let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today. We'll first begin with the southern plains. That is where we actually had a cluster of storms go through this morning. We saw some damaging winds, lots of rain, even some flash flooding down in Oklahoma. That's all now moving off to the east, and that'll be the end for the most part of showers and storms in Oklahoma and Texas, probably for the next few days for most areas. The only exclusion will be the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles. Back up in the northern plains, this is our area to watch for our next severe weather event across the central plains, northern plains, the Ohio Valley, and as well as the Midwest, and eventually going towards the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast over the next few days. That's going to be associated with actually a fairly organized low pressure system back up in the upper levels that is associated back up in northwestern Montana. This is going to move off to the east over the next few days. Severe weather will start to spawn off across the central plains and parts of the Midwest today, and then this threat will shift further off to the east as we go into tomorrow. We could see a pretty significant severe weather event as we go into tomorrow with a threat for a line of storms. I'll talk about more on that in just a moment. And then back over in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, we are finally seeing some relief from the relentless flash flooding that occurred back over in Vermont and parts of New England. The low pressure system is now moving off to the north and east. That is now causing flooding concerns across Canada, unfortunately, as the system slowly moves off to the north and east. But luckily, New England now is out of the track of that substantial rainfall that we've seen there over the past few days. Now let's talk more about the weather pattern that we're in right now and the big changes that are coming to this weather pattern. And we're going to begin looking at the jet stream. As of right now, we have a massive heat dome slash ridge back down in the southwest United States. And I had somebody ask, what is a heat dome? It's essentially a high pressure system during the summer that we see bringing extreme heat. And we are seeing that currently down in the southwest United States. One of the biggest negatives to all of this for those in the southern plains is this strong southerly pull. We've mentioned this in the last few forecasts, but this is very important because it's pulling tons of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico, making areas in the southern plains a lot more humid, which is making the field-like temperatures even worse than what the actual temperatures are. Now, back over in the eastern half of the United States, that low-pressure system is moving off to the north and east, and then that other low-pressure system is back over near Montana right now, and that's what's going to be our next severe weather event over the next few days. Now, once we go later into this week, that heat dome does not move really hardly an inch. It's going to stay in the same area back in the southwest United States. Strong southerly pull will continuing to rise tons of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico into the central plains and as well as the southern plains. Jet stream becomes a lot more flat. That is what we call a zonal jet stream. And then once we go later into the weekend, once we get closer to Saturday and to Sunday, you'll notice the jet stream is extremely flat and it's actually very weak. Once we start to not really notice any of those pink or purple colors, that's usually a fairly weak jet stream and it's not very defined at all. You'll notice the blues are very faint, which means again the upper level winds are fairly weak. Back in the southwest United States, that massive ridge continues. The most organized low pressure system that we'll have in the upper levels is back up in Canada. That might make some impacts to areas in the Midwest, but it's really going to be quite minimal, it looks like, as we go throughout the weekend. And then into early next week, that low pressure system dips further down to the south and east. That might be some good news for those in the Midwest and the Northeast. Unfortunately, though, that heat dome is really not going to do us any favors. It's actually going to move further to the east potentially as we go into next week. Things may change a little bit. That's why I said potentially. But overall, definitely something that's going to be concerning because if it tracks further to the east, that could increase the heat potential across areas in the central plains, the Midwest. It could get a lot warmer, basically, is what I'm saying, for a lot of areas that are already feeling warm at this point. So not good news there. So over the next few days, the temperature anomalies are indicating that we're going to have below average temperatures for some areas in the Midwest and the northern plains, much warmer and above average temperatures across the central plains, southern plains, the southwest United States, and then back into the Northeast. And then once we get closer to the weekend, that heat will just continue. Once we go into next week, that's when things become more uncertain, but you'll notice if that ridge does move off to the east, that big heat dome, we could be talking about really record-breaking high temperatures for a large chunk of the United States. So definitely concerning stuff there. Again, things could change over the next several days, and they will, but this is definitely going to be something to watch out for very closely over the next few days. Now let's talk more about the severe weather potential for the next several days, and we'll begin with today, which today is tossing trampolines on trees Tuesday. We currently do have a slight risk of severe weather from the central plains back into parts of Montana even, and through the Midwest, and we also have another marginal risk of severe weather back through the southern plains and then back into the Gulf Coast region region, but that risk is going to be starting to diminish over the next few hours. The main concern from here on out is going to be what we're watching back up in the Central Plains and then back into the Midwest. This is an area that we're watching for the main concerns of damaging winds and large hail. Here's your damaging wind potential. We do have a hatched area, which means there is a chance for damaging winds exceeding 75 miles per hour. There will be a couple storms that'll likely do that this evening, as an MCS, a mesoscale convective system, is possible. That basically is a fancy word for a line of storms that could very well produce that threat for damaging winds and even some significant hail. The hail potential is a bit more concerning because there's a much larger hatched area, but not just that, the lapse rates will be quite steep. So the initial cells that we see develop later this afternoon and evening will have a greater chance of producing hail upwards of apple size. That's about 3 inches in diameter. I wouldn't rule out a storm getting closer to 3.5 inches in diameter, but that risk does remain a bit lower, and that'll be very isolated overall in nature, so only a couple areas would even see that. And then again, that hatched area goes from Montana all the way back through Nebraska. There is a low chance for some sporadic hail all the way back through Illinois and then into Michigan, but again, the risk is quite low today. Tornado risk is also on the lower side of things. It's a 2% probability. I'm not that concerned about a tornado risk. I think there might be an isolated one, maybe 1 or 2 tornadoes at most, but they should be on the brief and weak side of things, and it shouldn't be anything too crazy. I think tomorrow's risk for tornadoes is much greater, and I'll show you why in just a moment. Here's the timing for severe weather today. So showers and storms will fire up back over in western South Dakota during the afternoon, so between about 4 to 6 o'clock. You'll see that at the top of your screen, so that's far southern South Dakota. Once we go into the evening hours, that's when storms will start to roll into Nebraska. This is when we could see an MCS develop. That's again a cluster slash line of storms, and you'll notice that back up in parts of central and northern Nebraska, a bit more of a Boeing area of storms. That is what's more concerning for an increased risk of damaging winds. We could still see some significant hail, but it will probably turn into more of a damaging wind potential through Nebraska. Once we go into the overnight hours, that line continues to push down to the south and east, and notice this area of storms actually remains quite organized. But I do want to mention that there is a chance that it is not as organized as what's pictured on the future radar. There is a possibility that this is much weaker and a smaller scale MCS that we'll actually be seeing today. Just keep that in mind. It might be a bit smaller than this, which would be better news for us. That means that the severe weather potential across this large area would be slightly lower than what's currently forecasted. But make sure you're prepared for damaging winds. Flying trampolines are also possible today, so make sure you take those proper precautions. Tomorrow's risk of severe weather, it's the same risk level, but it's not necessarily the same threats and the same potential. I do think the risk of severe weather will be a bit higher tomorrow overall. We could see actually an enhanced risk of severe weather. It's not out of the question, but it depends on what happens here over the next 24 hours with the current risk of severe weather that we have today. So as of right now, there's a slight risk of severe weather. It includes parts of the Midwest back into areas in the Central Plains. So from Kansas back into Illinois and as well as into Indiana. Main concern though for tomorrow is the risk for damaging winds. We will very likely see some sort of MCS tomorrow. And if an MCS is able to develop and maintain an organized area, we could see maybe an enhanced risk of severe weather for damaging winds, because I do think the overall threat of damaging winds is a bit higher tomorrow if, again, we see that MCS develop. As of right now, though, there's a hatched area across Missouri, western parts of Illinois, and as well as eastern Kansas. That does include areas near St. Louis and Kansas City, so make sure you're staying weather aware tomorrow and take the proper precautions tonight or early tomorrow morning before those storms do arrive. And then there's a chance of damaging winds outside of that. It's an equal chance, but that hatched area means that we have a chance for damaging winds exceeding 75 miles per hour. Large hail concern is primarily focused across the Kansas City area, anywhere near the Kansas City metro back into eastern Kansas. That's where we could see hail exceeding 2 inches in diameter, but I think the maximum hailstone size for tomorrow is around baseball-sized hail, so a little bit less than what the maximum hailstone size is for today. We could see a little bit of hail outside of that, though, but it's a very low chance overall. All that green is just a 5% chance within a 25-mile radius, so again, low chance overall. Tornado risk is low, but I think it's a bit higher tomorrow than today. We'll probably see at least a couple tornadoes tomorrow across this region. Again, that is if we do see that MCS develop, and that does include areas from western Indiana back into eastern Kansas. I might go live for the severe weather event, so make sure you're subscribed down below and click the bell icon so you're notified if and when I go live. Here's the timing for tomorrow. So again, that MCS that we'll see overnight tonight has a big play on what happens tomorrow. So you'll notice as we go into the morning hours that it starts to weaken off. So this around 7, 8 in the morning. So that'll move into areas like Illinois. Weakens out. Then during the afternoon, that's when we have to watch for a potential for another MCS to develop. So storms will start to fire off across Iowa and as well as northern Missouri during around 3 to 4 o'clock. So pretty much during rush hour. But what we need to really keep a close eye on is the storm development around sunset tomorrow over back in Kansas and as well as into Missouri. This is where we could see an MCS develop. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty whether this will become organized enough to actually become an MCS. We are definitely going to be watching though for some supercells developing, and those initial supercells will produce an increased risk of large hail, hence why we do have that hatched area for large hail. And eventually going into the overnight hours close to around midnight or so, that line moves down to the south south, this might become more organized by then, producing more of a damaging wind threat. So again, if this does end up happening, we start to see those signs of a significant MCS, I will go live for this, so make sure again that you stay tuned for that tomorrow evening. Now, going into Thursday, this is tossing trampolines on tall trees Thursday. We do have a large marginal risk. This is actually one of the largest marginal risks of severe weather that I think I've ever seen. I don't think we've had anything much larger than this. It's about 830,000 square miles large, and it covers a huge chunk of the United States. So this is one of the largest marginal risks we've ever seen. It doesn't mean a whole lot. It just means that we're looking at least some isolated severe weather across this very large area. I'll talk about more on this though in our next forecast, so make sure you stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to click the button down below and subscribe if you've not already.